Kelly, thank you very much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time. I'll let you kind of give a bit of an overview of your background and your current role, but obviously the president and CEO of Cystic Fibrosis Canada. You've been there now for, I think, almost 7 years. And you got, a number of years of experience in the nonprofit space. So just looking at your background, working with Ovarian Cancer Canada, leading programming there, working with Breakfast for Learning, South Riverdale Community Health Center, as well as Cancer Care Ontario, all in leadership roles. So thank you. I think your insight is going to be really, really invaluable for all the students. And maybe just to kick things off, I'll let you give a little bit of a background on yourself, your current role, and the organization where you work.
Great. So as you said, I'm Kelly Grover, and I do work at Cystic Fibrosis Canada. I've been here since 2018 in the role of CEO. My job here is just to build a great team to support me in the work here and to invest in solutions so that we are helping people with CF live a life without limits. And prior to that, I've worked in a number of charities, as you listed there. And I started my career in charity with Save Kids Canada and Planned Parenthood, and then took a little gap, few years, worked in the public sector, and then came back into charity. And I'll just kick it off by saying, because I just think communications and public relations and whatever you call it can sometimes be dabbling in marketing. It's critical to all elements of our work, not just raising money. It's everything we do. We're all being communicated to and about things, and it's really important to think about that work.
Yeah, I think it's a good I guess segue, and I definitely want to focus on the comms, the importance of comms in the industry. Maybe just before we delve into that, would love to know about, you mentioned your career trajectory, and you mentioned, you were sort of drawn to the nonprofit sector, then you went to the private sector before transitioning back to the nonprofit sector. Curious what it was about the nonprofit space that really attracted you and sort of drew you back in, even once you had, dabbled in other areas.
So just to be clear, I haven't worked private, just public, but maybe there's another time for that. We'll see. So I had always been interested in services that were provided to people. Like, I'm just going way back to when I was in university. They weren't really cool dual degrees that they have now, or different areas of concentration when I went 1,000 years ago. But when I got out of university, I was really interested in social programming, and it seemed to be social service organizations or social impact organizations. And so that's what drew me in. And then honestly, Eric, I was offered a position and I took it, but I wasn't out looking in public or in private sector. I just really was drawn to that kind of work. And it seemed to jazz me at the time. So I actually had my very, 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 very first, like, what I felt professional job at North York Harvest Food Bank, and then went to Save Kids Canada. And then for life circumstances, I was drawn into I worked at Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and then so sort of pivoted to public sector. And what drew me back was being in an organization that had more direct impact on people who lived with either a health issue or, circumstances like they didn't have food security. So, and I really like the intersection between business and, I don't know, social good. I don't like that lingo, but
Yeah.
I really like, and that's what a charity is. It's a small business that's doing good work, but it's still a business. And so I really like that intersection, and that's what drew me back into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I think, we talk a lot about the nonprofit sector, and I think that's one real important distinction, is that at the end of the day, you operate like a business. You need to, generate revenue. There has to be that mindset in place. So I'm curious, like, when it comes to communications and storytelling, uh, how does that fit into your business model as a nonprofit, as a registered charity?
So it's critical, and it is, so it's named in our strategic plan, and like, I'm not really good on my lingo, whether it's in our policies and procedures, but it is it's in our values and it's in our strategic plan. So we are here on behalf of people who have, in this case, cystic fibrosis. And I don't have cystic fibrosis. We have a couple, we have somebody on our board who does, and we've had lived experience, people with family members. But it is critical, like, I can't, like, bar none, that the experiences of people who have cystic fibrosis are informing our work, and that we are facilitating their stories to be shared with others. It is tricky, though, because you don't want to be in a position of exploitation of people's story. You don't want to be like, I'll take somebody, who has, Georgia, who has cystic fibrosis, and I'm like, propping her up and telling the story over again. It needs to be authentic and told by the person, but it's critical that their voices and experiences are not only informing our work, are being shared for others on behalf of us doing their work.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. That's one, discussion point that I have with my students in our PR and philanthropy class, talking about like patient perspective and how critical it is from a communications perspective to be able to share that patient perspective. Because again, the brand or the organization can share that, but it doesn't evoke the same emotional response as if you have the individual involved in that storytelling process. So I'm curious, how do you engage your patient population, your stakeholders? How do you engage them to be part of that process and share their stories with your key target audiences?
Yeah, so maybe going to go back to something that I'm just making a note to answer the question, but I have to be honest, and I feel like there's a bit of a platform because you've got students studying, but I am absolutely gobsmacked when people are not, like, that we even have to talk about sharing the stories or talking about people with lived experience, their engagement in our work. How could I possibly, or not me, us, talk about cystic fibrosis without like knowing the people we serve? Like we're I really think of us as like we're a facilitator of the experience, and so we have different ways of doing that. But I'm always surprised that people would go out and speak on behalf of like people with ovarian cancer without like maybe doing that with the community of people with ovarian cancer. It's just like and I know it happens, but I'm just I don't think that's good business, and I don't even know how you would do that. I think that and the one part I'd say is sometimes it's very challenging because people are very, very sick. So in the case, I did work in ovarian cancer, people were in the hospital. They were very, very sick. So you also have to be mindful of that. And how are you going to facilitate other people knowing about their lives and their experience? How do we do it? Well, multitude of ways, but we do have a program in place called Elevate where people can register. And it's not like a formal like membership program, but it allows people then to put their hand up and say, I want to share my experience. I want to, it might be, we have, let's say we're doing a survey on something, so that brings their experience into us, but it's also, we keep like a story bank, but it's not a people bank, so that we can draw on different people at different times to share their experience. And it's important that we get a multitude of experience as well. Sometimes some of us who are extroverted might put our hand up more than others, and then you only remember, I'm going to call on Erick for that story. Well, we're a big country. Cystic fibrosis is a very heterogeneous disease. We want to have as many different experiences as possible shared. And there's different ways to share your experience. One, you could be like really outspoken, like I want to go out and I want to speak. and go to a gala and tell my story. And then there might be like, oh, I don't like doing that. I want to just be interviewed. Or maybe I just want to share a note through social media or what have you. So like we do have a program for this, but then there's like more ad hoc ways where we might do an annual giving campaign at the end of the year, a year-end campaign. And so it's a big deal for us to raise a lot of money. And we might go out and ask some people to, if we're looking for certain types of angles for stories as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? I think what you're kind of talking about, it's like you're building these long-term relationships with your patients, right? The patient group. And you know, I think that that's important because like you said, then you have the ability to kind of go back to the well and you can really share different perspectives, different experiences that help to inform, the general public about how, cystic fibrosis really is a disease that affects everybody very, very differently. And that's something we were just chatting about before we started the call.
Yeah, and I think something that's been a huge challenge for us in this space recently is there's a number of people who, as you know, we have a new drug available to many people, but there's a group of people that don't have access to this drug because they have a different kind of, their cystic fibrosis impacts them differently. And so those people, many of them actually don't want to share their story. They're depressed, they're sad, they're just despondent, I think, just like, why should I? There's not going to be any new therapy for me. And if we, as an organization, we have a value around being informed by our community and connected, and they're telling the stories, it's tricky when you can't get people. We're knocking on doors and people don't want to speak, and then you're going to the same people over and over again, and that's not always great for them too. You want to sort of spread the love a bit. So yeah, it's been tricky.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge. And I think, certainly you can understand why some of those individuals would have that perspective. How do you go about then sort of, not hand holding, but walking them through the process of like, this is why this is important. This is what we are hoping to achieve as an organization, and this is why we need your help. Like, what does that look like?
We flip it a little bit because I think it's more about them and what they can do for their community. So, like less about us and more about that they're, if this was a motivator to them, that by telling their story, they're motivating other people who might feel left behind, who also have a rare mutation, and they're speaking to them, for them. And that has been somewhat helpful to some people. I think it's just really kind of, honestly, Eric, I feel like it's just meeting people where they're at. Like if they're not interested, they're not interested. It's more about trying to find more people. That is one of the hardest parts of our job, is you are trying to know the people in your community. And, people have cystic fibrosis, but they also have jobs. They also are parents. They also are best friends. They've got other things going on. They're not just their disease. So not everybody is like, hey, and now I want to speak about my CF to other people. So I do think it's about knowing more people in your neighborhood to kind of have your database fuller with people, meeting them where they're at. I'm sure the team has to do a bit of like, it's not persuasion, but just kind of like creating safety for people. We always have people write their own story and then they read it to us and we work together on it. I'm talking a lot about story, but I think it's important. Some people will come back with like, here's 40 minutes of material about my story. And, we're all like, social media, we've got the attention span is very short. So we have to work with them to maybe like shorten it. And that can be very difficult because you're trying to give that person agency, but also realizing that the recipient of the information, let's say if you're speaking at a gala, it's kind of like people are sitting there all night. You can't go up and speak for 40 minutes. That can be delicate. But again, I think if you just, I don't know, have good people skills and talk to people like they're people, you can kind of get them moving to a win-win.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I was going to ask you, how do you kind of empower, people in your communities to really tell their own stories authentically? And I mean, that's a great example, right? It's about sort of, engaging them, letting them develop almost like the scripting that they want to focus on, but then also working with them from a communications perspective to make sure that it's appropriate for the right medium that you're leveraging in that
Totally.
specific situation.
I mean, there are people that do this in the disease space, in the patient like disease space. I haven't seen it at CF, but I did witness it in cancer, where they work with patients to like, it's almost like a little workshop on telling your story, how to tell your
Mhm.
story. You write it out first, and you write the whole thing out. Like, we all have a story, right? Like, I don't have cystic fibrosis, but I may have some other story in my family. So write the whole thing out. And then you get it out. Like, that's the big thing. Sometimes for some people, it's the first time they've ever told their story at all, and they have lots of things to tell. So, and there's like trained facilitators who usually have disease themselves, and they'll start to work with people. It's just like you work in communications. It's kind of, what is the most important pieces to tell. Sometimes you have to go big to comb it back down. Um, and sometimes that isn't the right storyteller for what the objectives are of the organization at that time. So I can think deeply about the galas, because we always have a person speaking there. It's very moving for people. We are also have an objective to raise money. So you are hoping that the speaker will motivate people as well to think this is a worthy cause. So
Mhm.
sometimes one might feel a bit gross with that, but so we usually pick a speaker who understands that. We're there to raise money like that, and we do good stuff with that money.
Yep.
Um, but we're a little strategic with who we bring in. Then is that person able to angle their story? Do they understand kind of the objectives of that fundraising, mechanism we're doing, versus there are other opportunities to tell the story where we're not raising money.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It kind of goes back to how we started the conversation where you talked about how at the end of the day, it's a business, right? And you've got, things that you want to accomplish as an organization, but obviously funding is very, very pivotal for that. I'm curious, like it's such a crowded, oversaturated space now, the charitable space in Canada, and we're dealing with this period of kind of economic uncertainty. Inflation is an issue. Food insecurity is an issue. Housing is an issue. Canadians are kind of stretched. How have you approached that from like a business perspective, and how has communications helped you maybe overcome some of those challenges?
Well, I think first of all, we are impacted by all those things, and we are deeply lucky because we are a rare disease that's really usually raised most of its money from people impacted by the disease and their people.
Right.
So we kind of we have a little bit of protection. But the minute those people, like all of us, are impacted by inflation and what have you, then that dials us back. So we were very impacted by COVID because of the type of fundraising we did, which was event fundraising, was a lot of our money. But we were sort of more protected than other more uh, maybe larger health charities, more, I'm going to say more generic, but less boutique. Like, we're very much for CF community, funded by the CF community. Now, we certainly have friends and family corporate who maybe don't have CF, but they typically will have some connection back to the disease.
Right.
So that protects us a little bit in that way. Now, in terms of how does communications help us? Well, we have, for example, we had a time when we were not communicating about the work we did. and well enough, and we were doing very good work, but we weren't sharing our story with people impacted by the disease well enough. So if you don't tell anybody what you're doing, they don't think you're doing anything, some people, and that's what happened. And so that got us into a bit of a, I'm not even going to call it a full crisis, but a bit of a situation where our community was pretty angry, or some were, or miffed. And so the lack of communications got us in it, and the good communications got us out of it. So, and that included one-on-one, me doing a lot of phone calls with people, me talking to a lot of individuals. So that's that type of communication. And then it's also, which required the CEO. And then it's also about like just being more transparent. I can't stand that word because the opposite is not being transparent, but it was just over communicate about what you're doing. Tell the community what you're doing. They are very stressed about this medication coming to Canada. Tell them you've got it, or this is what you're doing, and over communicate on the steps. In terms of then, so that's some ways that I think communication is critical. And I'm a huge believer in like kind of the over communication, knowing the vibe of your charity that you're in. If it's really grassroots and quite, I don't know what crunchy is what I was going to call it, like then communicate in that way, really more down to earth. Don't make it so corporate if that's not resonating with the group you're with. And so it's also like not just what you're saying, it's tone that you're saying it with. And I've really seen that over the time at CF Canada. So, you know, we needed to course correct, and we did. And now we're in a different phase of the disease. And now we really need to raise a lot more money. So our communications changes again to sort of resonate with people that might be more in a donor space as opposed to just talking about our advocacy work. So it's kind of, it pivots depending on the objectives, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, that's, you really have to have your finger on the pulse of the stakeholders and the groups that you work with, right? So how did it become evident that maybe there was this gap in communications, like with your patient group in the example that you mentioned? Was that brought to your attention, or was it a learning curve over a period of time? Talk a little bit about that.
No, it's pretty instant, and people just, there was a lot of anger and misunderstanding. And so it wasn't directed to me, it was directed to others. And then I was told about it. And then I knew, it sounds very arrogant, but I knew right away what the gap was. Like right away, we're not telling our story well enough. And I'll tell your team this, or your students this, which I had told you when we had these conversations. I did not have, we had a number of vacancies on our communications team. I'm not sure we had the right people there to understand what was the feelings were for the community. They were a little flat-footed when this happened. And then the people doing the advocacy work understood it, but they were trying to do the advocacy work. So a lot of lessons learned there. And I think I also learned a lot about the community. I thought some of the commentary wasn't fair directed to us as well. I think there's a lot of pressure on charities to do a lot of things with limited resources. And that is the big difference between business. When there's a business gap, sometimes, not always, because businesses have a very hard bottom line too, but there's sometimes you can pivot and just get more resources in. We can pivot pretty quickly, but getting the more resources in is difficult. And the CF community is a very tight-knit, involved community, and they were angry, and I think we were just good bait for that too. Like it was like, just make it work, make it go, make it not go away, make it better. And my goodness, though, one of the, like what felt like the worst communications moment of my career is now a story I tell as one of my best, because we really pivoted, did all the right things, and we landed in a much better, stronger organization and stronger connection with our community, I feel. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like when you think about, again, I won't refer to it as a crisis, but like issues management, uh, it's all about understanding, and doing the research to understand what are the objectives, what are the things that you should be focusing on as an organization, and being prepared to pivot and being nimble, and then being able to, again, shift your approach to address those things. And
well, I
I
think
think
it's,
also,
go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say it's very easy sometimes to just put your head down, do the work, especially when you're low on resources, and you don't get that full holistic picture of what you need to do or should be doing.
Well, I think it's about like you might be doing the right work, but you've got to show your work. Like
Yeah.
that was my, I'm not good at that, like even with the board. So you must show your work. You have to over communicate about your work, because if people don't see it or know about it, they're just negative. They're not thinking, oh, they've got it. It's like they don't got it. And that was such a big lesson. Now I do feel we can we became over communicating about our work, and now we're in a different phase and we can dial that back and talk more about the impact of our work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think it's just knowing your community, and and just being prepared. And that's an example of, I'm not sure we knew our community, but they were not prepared for the vibe of it. And I was there. But you know what, Eric, if we had not had that experience and I'd not gone through this, I wouldn't be a better, like I have like, I'll say to everybody on this call, in this video, like you have got to go through some tough times. And I can tell you, you will be so much better for it. I know it's so cliche, but we're better organization. We've got a better connection to the community, and we're so much more deliberate on what we're communicating and when and why we're not communicating. So when I get asked, why didn't I know you hired an executive assistant, Kelly, which I get asked a fair bit, or why didn't I know so-and-so worked at Cystic Fibrosis Canada by our community, I can now say, well, I'm not sure that's relevant to us and the impact we're driving for you.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I think also having a team who, actually, my last part would be just being honest about, which I was with the folks that were complaining, just we don't have the right team right now to be able to do what I think is important to do. And kind of letting the chatter be noise a little bit and focusing on getting the work done. So
Yeah, I love that. I think, again, I teach classes on crisis communications again as well. And, the sort of golden rule is you've got to acknowledge, you've got to accept, you've got to just apologize and authentically admit when there are, things that you have maybe botched a little bit. And then also, showcase what it is you're going to do to fix it, and then go and do it, which it sounds like you
100%.
did.
Humility is a very important quality to have as a leader, and at all times, but especially those times. Hey, we didn't do this right, and here's how we're going to fix it, and this is how we're going forward. And then if it's still noisy for you, you sort of have to go like this. I think the other part that I just would stress on that is what vehicles you use. Like we have used different vehicles, newsletter, video, social media, what have you. It's about picking the right ones at the right time. Sometimes I call it, you can hit two, like you don't know your culture well enough, and you might go, it required something more corporate, like informal, and you went to the wrong vehicle. I think that's a big part of all of this too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of building on that, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about like the structure of your team and who within the organization kind of owns communication, and what that looks like from sort of an organizational perspective at CF Canada.
Yeah, so we have an executive team, and then all of the functions come out of that area. So we have a chief scientific officer, and he does all of the work that would be considered kind of on the disease side of things, or, our advocacy, our healthcare research, our registry. Then we have Chief Financial Officer, and so that's finance, IT, human resources, all of our supports for our fundraising, behind the scenes stuff. Then we have a Chief Development Officer, and that person is responsible for all fundraising. And then we have a Chief Marketing Communications Officer, and that person has all of the marketing and the internal and external communications. And then she also right now has all of our community engagement, including our volunteer engagement. That could be in different areas, but that right now, so that person who has community engagement also has all of our work we're doing in support for our community. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the communication sit is underneath her.
And I mean, it sounds like, really communications is sort of something that is, I guess, dispersed in a lot of ways across many of your staff, right? Regardless of what the role is, whether you're in marketing, communications, development, yourself, the executive team. How do you sort of look at communications? It's not a function of just one department. It's something that the entire organization should be contributing to and engaged with.
So her job is, I kind of think of her as chief stakeholder officer. So her job is to think about all of the different people we communicate with and for, and what for. And she has a matrix for that, of how we're going to do that. But she's not going to have it like at a micro level of, so we're going to communicate with the clinicians about X, Y, Z. But she has a bit of as much of a map or a matrix as we can have for the year. So I almost think of her as, like I said, she's chief traffic cop, kind of that's in, that's out. Because we were over, so let's say you're a clinician and you're also a person with CF and you're also a donor. You were getting like multitude of things and we just looked like we were tripping all over ourselves with messaging going to you. So she sort of sets like the overall. But then there might be, I have a staff person who has to communicate often to clinicians or somebody else to researchers about. Some of that gets caught, so we know it's happening at our executive tables. So you'll know, oh, there's a letter going to researchers, let's say, about X, Y, Z. So it gets caught there. And so we're small enough that the executive team lead might know about something and be able to manage the tone or the content, but we're still working at this. So, and one of the key pieces to this is to have good database. And so just because our community is so splintered, like a clinician is also a donor, it's very incestuous, is also could be like a parent with CF. So because I said that was our benefit of like our community so tight, but they wear multiple hats. And so they're getting multiple messaging or communications going to them. So we're working on this. And I think the data will be a really big part of this. So I'll know that Erick got our newsletter inviting him to the town hall. And it also was reinforced to him through maybe you're a major gift donor. And you also learned about it there, but like we'll be able to see that and sort of have more, not nuanced, but like communications that is more personalized for you, like and less clunky. But that is a little bit of a longer term thing. We're just working on our data now.
Yeah, that is very cool, and I love to hear about how you're making those critical decisions based on data, based on research, right? And it's almost like it's part of the digital transformation that we're seeing in the industry. Of course, social media, was a sort of a big sort of tidal wave that all organizations had to adapt to, decades or so ago. But now we're also seeing the evolution of AI and the evolution of some of these other digital platforms. How do you kind of navigate that from a communications perspective to ensure that you are staying relevant as an organization?
Well, we just try. Like that's what I was gonna say. We're just trying. We talk to other people in our space. Our leaders, might be part of like the Canadian Marketing Association, or they'll have their own peer groups. And so we try to stay as relevant of what's happening. I never feel like we're ahead of things always. I'm sure we are on some things. But But AI, it's going to be discussed at the board because there's a board policy needed on this. We dabble in the space a little bit right now, but we're probably not, we're not leaders. We're in the middle. But I'll give you social media as an example. Right now, a lot of people are leaving social media. Charities we have for, I want to say political, but for, reasons that are based on values. And, so we're thinking about those things. Again, we're not leading in that space. I just find there's too many things for us to stay on top of, but certainly we're using our board as forward lookers. So we're managing the day to day and, the next 3 years, but the board's job is to come in and help us stay abreast of things that we need to be. So if AI was coming down the pipeline, that they would have had that on their radar. The same with the issues with social media. But that's how we try to stay relevant. And or I'm reading things, and then we're looking at them and trying to change our approach. But it is random because we're just too busy. So we just try to, like, in a good way, we're nimble though too. So we can be like, oh, I read this and we should maybe think about this, like, especially with social media, like everybody was changing right away and getting off Facebook because they pulled the fact checkers, but most of our community's on Facebook with us. And so we're doing some research to see if that's a good or bad decision for us.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly interesting. And I think it's very tough right now to make those decisions because in a lot of ways you don't have the right answers yet. You don't have all the information to make informed decisions. So I think it's interesting to hear how you look to the board, you look to, everyone to really be, have their finger on the pulse of what's happening
and I
in
think,
the
Erick,
space.
we look at our data, like we'll look at how things are performing. We're not, like, I always feel we could do better in this space, but we certainly look at, oh my gosh, if we did a campaign on Facebook, we'll look at, whatever the engagement rate we wanted to target on that. We'll have targets for things. So we are, I feel, using our time wisely, which then is using our money wisely. So.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I want to just touch on kind of looking ahead. So, we kind of covered a lot of ground here, but I'm curious about, your thoughts in terms of, is there one major change that you would like to see in the nonprofit sector in the next decade? Is there one major thing that you think needs to be addressed?
One major change. Well, I think it might be a perception change that I wouldn't mind seeing.
Sure.
A lot of people will say, oh, I'm going to finish my, and I'll see recruiters do this. I'm going to finish my private sector job, and then I'm going to go like relax before I retire, and I'm going to go to a charity. And I just find it so disrespectful to the sector. It's one of the hardest jobs you could have stakeholder wise. It may not be in other parts. I think other businesses might have way more complexity to them. But definitely with the engagement and the stakeholders, you're serving people who have a fatal disease and their family member does. Like, that is very extra. If my red wine isn't on the shelf, I think we can all live with that in somewhere. So I think it's a bit of a perception of, like, we're a business, and I'll have people say, oh gosh, I didn't realize your job was full time, or I thought you were a volunteer. So I think there's that. And I think also this won't change, and I think it's fair game. It's just how you manage it. I think the expectations on charities from people with lived experience, people not with lived experience, donors, even like government, like, we're doing a lot of work that should be publicly funded or is in other parts. I think it's like, oh, and you shouldn't take any money from this group, or you should have spoken out about that. It's like, my gosh, like, just we're trying our best here. I think there's a lot of scrutiny about the money received and the money spent. And I've had a good career now that I can say most charities, of course, there's going to be bad apples in every bushel, but most charities are run by very good people trying to run good businesses. And I think that that would be kind of a perception of like this, we're just running wild out here in the wild, wild west is just not, I have not been my experience with not just my organization, but others. So
Yeah. That's interesting. And it's like a perception thing too. I know there are third-party organizations that do, I guess, like, they audits of charitable organizations, and they provide like kind of rankings and information. But how do you do that as an organization on your own to sort of educate the public about where your dollars, or where their dollars, I should say, are going, and how you're leveraging the resources that you do have?
well, so first I'm going to speak to the first part. That organization that does that, go do a little research on them as well, which we have, and they are not always reviewing the right things, and who's reviewing them, I'm not sure has the expertise to do that. So
Interesting. Yeah.
we would welcome that. We actually spoke to them and we're like, no, we do this. Oh, we didn't see that. So there's, again, it's all comes out in the wash. Like everything's in the middle, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
We are accredited by Imagine Canada. Imagine Canada has standards for charities that you can apply to be an accredited organization, and we are, and it's very rigorous, and we have to go through a number of different different standards we have to adhere to for the overall standard. So to be accredited, so we do that, and each I think it's every 2 years we have to do an update on that. So there's a number of elements in that. And then in terms of financial transparency, our information is posted on our website of where our money goes, and we do audits once a year, and abide by CRA has guidance on how much money should go to your programs, how much to your fundraising, and how much to your admin. So we have targets for that that the board approves, and we stay within that. So.
Yeah, and it's an interesting sort of behind the curtain look, because I think there's so many people that just have the perception that you're making these decisions willy-nilly, and there's maybe you should be focusing on different areas, but there's a lot of rigor and a lot of strategy that goes into that process, and there's also guidelines that you are sort of adhering to, right?
It's just different mindset, because people think about it as, I put my dollar into your organization. I could also say, I bought my Rogers TV package and I'm giving money to that company, and they have shareholders, and I have a board, and we serve the community. So I actually think there's more accountability, and it should be like, it is people's money. Like, but I think there's just an extra layer of perception, and sort of the questions I get asked are a little bit different than I think in other places, and that's fine. Like, I'm not weighing on that. It's just, I think if people maybe knew more about Imagine Canada and its accreditation and why it was important, we try to share, but we can't. We have it on our signature and tell the story a bit about it, but it's just perception takes a while to change, as you know. That's a whole other video.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, I mean, this is great. I think I'm mindful of your time, and maybe just to kind of wrap things up, I'm curious. There's a lot of sort of young students who are going to be watching this, individuals that are going to be looking for sort of their first opportunities in communications, and they're going to be sort of hitting the pavement, looking to sort of secure that first job. What advice would you give them as someone who is, hiring young folks all the time, I'm sure? Is there guidance or advice that you would give to someone who's kind of looking to sort of make that career transition, or their first sort of pivotal career, get that first pivotal career role?
I have so many thoughts that came to mind when you said that. So one is, I'm going to lead with this, but I don't want your students to groan when I say it. But I do think like, it's not volunteering, but it's like getting some experience under your belt, and being able to share that on your CV. Like, just, I didn't have buckets of experience when I started, but I had some jobs. That's like, but they don't have to be jobs. I know it's very, very different now for people. The other part is, you cannot ever underestimate the power of networking.
Yeah.
I can't even, like, it's helped me then, it helps me now, it helps younger people. Hi, can I have 15 minutes of your time? Can you help me position myself for like a future? tell me more about what you do in your job. I've had a number of jobs in the middle of my career. I was like, oh my God, I couldn't stand what I did in my day job, yet it was very interesting to study or to talk about, but like find more information about it. That, is assuming you've got 1,000,001 offers. It's very, very hard to get your foot in the door. And it was the same. People tell me it's different now. I can tell you it was very, very, very hard for me to get my foot in the door. And the only way I did is I volunteered on the Social Planning Council of Etobicoke. And then he knew someone who maybe had a position, and I took a part-time position, and I was old and I still lived at home. Just telling you, it exists. It existed back then. And, but it got my foot in the door. And then that person knew somebody that was hiring at another job. And I cannot stress that enough. We don't try to hire by like, if Eric knew someone and his daughter, that will get you in and we'll talk to you. But it's really kind of like we try to go equal. And try to exploit some of the opportunities. If there's internships or like whatever kind of opportunity, try to exploit those and network. And then the other thing is you want people, guys, I can't believe I'm going to say this to you, but I'm going to say it because it's my pet peeve. Shake my hand firmly, look me in the eye. And as I tell my 16-year-old, you don't have to keep looking at me in the eye. Stand up when you meet me, repeat my name, introduce yourself, and professionalism in that way. I don't even know if it's professional. Connection will go so far because you're not always going to be online with people. And it's really important of your like how you show up is what I'm going to say. And when you're in an interview, tell your story. That's the opportunity to like really sell yourself, tell your story, bring yourself alive.
I love that advice.
If you're doing this work, I have so much, I feel like I could do a podcast on this. I really think a lot of people do not interview well, and they are amazing people. And that'll be our next one, Eric. We'll go off and we'll do a shindig on how to interview. Okay.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's so important. And I think your advice is so critical because I tell my students all the time, this whatever program you may be taking is not enough, right? That's table stakes. You have to do the hard work. You have to hit the pavement. You've got to get out there, meet people, shake hands. And we all look at LinkedIn, and if you see a job and you apply for it, there's hundreds of applicants. So how do you differentiate yourself, right?
100%. Listen, there's a guy I know, his daughter has CF. He's looking for work. He was like downsized out of his job. He's in the middle of his career. Yeah. And I said to him, you got to go back. You got to do the old school. Like, it's like, hey, Kelly, I saw you linked, Kelly Grover. Could I have 15 minutes of your time just to talk to you about best positioning myself for blah, blah, blah. Most people have 15 minutes to give somebody for positioning. They want to pay it forward. Most, not all.
Yeah.
Most.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting too, because your point is very poignant where it's not just about what you do when you're first starting in the industry. You have to keep developing these relationships and doing these things as you progress, right? Even to someone like yourself who's in the C-suite level.
Yeah. I have it right now. I'm like, I would like to do something different with my volunteer time. I don't think I'm knowing well enough. I've got to get back out there. I'm having calls again. It never ends. So if you're an introvert, I'm sorry, this is the work.
That's it. I love it. That's a great way to end. Well, thank you very much, Kelly. Again, this is super helpful. I know the students will get a lot out of it. And I certainly have enjoyed chatting. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts and time. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to touch on?
No, I say go into nonprofit and charity. You'll meet the greatest people and you will be making a difference for people. And you cannot, it gives me shivers just even saying it. It's pretty special.
I love it. That's great. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.